Good afternoon. The Subcommittee on Technology and Innovation will come to order. Pursuant to notice, Subcommittee on Technology and Innovation meets today to consider the following measure. Committee print the Natural Hazards Risk Reduction Act of 2011. We will now proceed with the markup. Beginning with opening statements, I'm going to be brief as it is my intention to yield the balance of my time to Ms. Biggert. I am pleased to call the markup this morning for consideration of the committee print of the Natural Hazards Risk Reduction Act of 2011. As we've tragically witnessed this year, earthquakes and windstorms take lives, destroy homes and businesses, and cause billions of dollars of damage in the United States and around the world. The effects of these disasters can reverberate for decades. Portions of all 50 states are vulnerable to earthquake hazards, and according to the United States Geological Survey, 26 urban areas in 14 U.S. states face significant seismic risk. Though infrequent, earthquakes are unique among natural hazards in that they strike without warning. Millions of Americans across the U.S. live in areas vulnerable to storms with damaging winds, and as populations continue to grow in areas prone to hurricanes, tornadoes, and windstorms, our vulnerability to severe weather will only increase. This past April, our subcommittee held a hearing examining earthquake risk in the United States and our efforts to develop hazard reduction measures. I'm pleased that Congresswoman Biggert plans to introduce the Natural Hazards Risk Reduction Act of 2011, which will address important research and development activities to reduce the risk and impact of earthquake and windstorm hazards. I want to thank Representative Biggert and Representative Nagelbauer for collaborating on this effort. I look forward to moving this important legislation forward. I yield the balance of my time to the gentlelady from Illinois for any comments she may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for scheduling this important markup today. And I haven't had the opportunity to congratulate the ranking member, Edwards, for taking over this important committee. The Natural Hazards Risk Reduction Act of 2011 reauthorizes two important multi-agency programs that address hazards faced by millions of Americans. The National Earthquake Hazard Reduction Program, also known as NEHRP. These names are going to be very difficult to talk about, and the National Windstorm Impact Reduction Program, known as NWIRP, support research and development to better understand and prepare for earthquakes and windstorms. Briefly, the committee print includes a few changes to NEHRP program that improves its mission and reduces duplicity. These changes include reauthorizing the program for 3 years, further detailing of the role of NIST as the lead program agency, updating the existing advisory committee for NEHRP to offer recommendations and assessments on programs developments, priorities, and coordination. The committee print also directs an interagency coordinating committee chaired by the director of NIST with overseeing the planning and coordination of both the earthquake and wind hazard programs. The single interagency coordinating committee replaces two separate interagency committees overseeing the current earthquake and windstorm programs and provides a framework for coordination of a multi-hazards approach to mitigating national disasters. As co-chair of the High Performance Building Caucus, we frequently hold briefings on building safety and security, a defining attribute of a high-performing building. In fact, we've held a briefing in April on the seismic readiness of the U.S. building inventory and the importance of updating building codes and standards to mitigate risks in communities. The NEHRP data and monitoring information is the foundation for those safety codes and standards. Without it, we wouldn't understand what areas of our country are most risk-prone and what areas are least prepared. That's why I believe the reauthorization of this program is important for all of us. A little knowledge and improvement in earthquake risk measures go a long way in protecting life and property. Mr. Chairman, the committee print has been endorsed by the American Geophysical Union and the National Council of Structural Engineers Associations. I urge members to support this legislation and yield the balance of time to Mr. Nagelbauer for any comments he may have on the National Windstorm Impact Reduction Program.
I thank the gentlewoman, and I'll be brief as well. The Natural Hazards Risk Reduction Act of 2011, as was mentioned, authorizes the National Windstorm Impact Reduction Program, or NWIRP, program that I first introduced in 2004. It focuses on mitigating the damage from wind hazards through research designed to help us better understand the behavior and impacts of windstorms. The program includes research and development to improve model codes, voluntary standards, and construction practices for buildings and the lifelines. Basic research to better understand windstorms, atmospheric science research, and data collection, and the development of risk assessment tools and mitigation techniques. The original authorization for NWERP expired in 2008, and although some agency work in this area has continued, it is currently difficult to determine the impact of agency activities and spending on wind hazard reduction measures. This committee print makes changes into NWERP to bring increased transparency to the program, including naming NIST as the lead program agency, which will ensure improved coordination and planning for agency activities. I would like to thank Chairman Quayle for holding this markup today and Representative Biggert for her commitment to reauthorizing these programs. I also like to note that the windstorm bill I introduced in October, which has been included in the Natural Hazards Research Risk Act, has been endorsed by the American Society of Civil Engineers. I believe we should work to get these important programs reauthorized, and I look forward to working with other members to strengthen this committee print in preparation for introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Nagelbauer and Mrs. Biggert. I now recognize Ms. Edwards for 5 minutes to present her opening remarks.
Thank you, Chairman Quayle, and thank you to Mrs. Biggert and Mr. Nagelbauer for your contributions and for holding today's markup to reauthorize two important programs, the National Earthquake Hazards Reduction Program. Mrs. Biggert, I share your concern, NEHRP, and the National Windstorm Impact Reduction Program, NWERP. The reauthorization of these programs is very timely, as there have been a record number of declared federal disasters in the U.S. this year, resulting in economic damage exceeding $45 billion. It's already the deadliest year for tornadoes in the United States since 1936, with 550 fatalities so far. The images of devastation from our colleague Congresswoman Sewell's district in Alabama and those of an almost completely flattened Joplin, Missouri, were nothing less than heartbreaking. Even in my own district and state, we've suffered hurricane and wind damage this year, and I've had earthquake damage, in fact, at my home. The best way to minimize the loss of lives and property caused by natural disasters, as well as reduce disruptions to our economy, is to create communities that are disaster resilient. NEHRP and NWERP support research and development programs to better understand earthquakes and windstorms and their impact, and to improve the resiliency of buildings and critical lifelines. This work has led to advancements in monitoring and building practices and has increased awareness and preparation by the public. Today's committee print makes a number of important improvements to these programs, including establishing NIST as the lead agency for both NEHRP and NWERP and placing the responsibility for interagency coordination in the hands of agency directors who have the authority to make both budgetary and programmatic decisions. I'm pleased that we're also able to work together over the last week on additional changes that we will consider as part of the manager's amendment. Despite this and my strong support for the reauthorizations of these programs, I do still have some concerns with the committee print that we're considering today. First, even though these programs have proven track records in bolstering the resiliency of our communities and reducing the costs associated with natural hazards, and despite the fact that experts have expressed concern that insufficient funding has negatively impacted the implementation of these programs and contributed to the loss of low-cost mitigation opportunities, the committee print that we're considering today cuts the funding authorizations for these programs and then freezes funding over the authorization period. When we consider the devastating losses that have plagued the United States this year and the potential cost associated with a larger-scale disaster like the earthquake in Japan, this course of action seems irresponsible. I urge my colleagues to consider the long-term savings these programs will provide. Studies of FEMA's pre-disaster mitigation program have shown that for every dollar we invest in mitigation activities, we actually save $3 to $4 in recovery costs. We can and should be doing more to help our communities be prepared so we can realize those cost savings. In addition, despite the leadership's attempts to clarify authorization protocol, confusion remains. Not only is it increasingly difficult for my Democratic colleagues to understand what the rules of the road are at any given moment or how to craft amendments that comply with them, I think this uncertainty has actually resulted in some bad policy. In this case, we have a combination of seemingly arbitrary numbers that seem to be justified only by an effort to comply with an absurd protocol and not on real-world need and the experiences that we've had in our communities. I also want to take a moment to talk about a disturbing trend that seems to be emerging, and that is on bills that have traditionally enjoyed bipartisan support, such as this. There's been a startling lack of outreach, although, to be fair, the majority did ask for input on today's committee print, which I do appreciate, but only because the previously scheduled markup was postponed due to factors not within control of the majority. And so thankfully we've had an opportunity to participate at some level in this committee print. In the last Congress, the markup of the previous iteration of the bill was preceded by weeks and perhaps months of outreach and negotiation with the minority. As a result, we incorporated many Republican ideas, legislative priorities in the bill, and Ranking Member Smith agreed to be an original co-sponsor. That bill ultimately passed, I think, on a suspension vote by a vote of 335 to 50, which included the support of many notable Republican members, including our Speaker, Majority Leader Cantor, and Majority Whip Kevin McCarthy. This was a terrific example of bipartisan legislating, and it was a better bill as a result of the process. I think that bipartisanship does take work, and it takes a willingness, and I know a willingness certainly that I've shared with Mrs. Biggert to compromise, and I think that's been noticeably lacking, at least in this process. So I sincerely hope that the members of the subcommittee can move forward in a more productive and bipartisan manner in the future, and particularly on issues such as these, which have historically benefited from bipartisan support. And I would note that over on the Senate side, this is moved in a bipartisan fashion, and it would seem that if we want to get to a point where we have a bill that's signed into law, that we should proceed in that direction. And with that, I yield.
Thank you, Ms. Edwards. There being no further discussion, without objection, all member opening statements will be placed in the record at this point. We will now consider the committee print, the Natural Hazards Risk Reduction Act of 2011. Without objection, I ask unanimous consent that the committee print is considered as read and open to amendment at any point, and that members proceed with amendments in order listed on the roster. So ordered. Are there any amendments to the committee print?
Mr. Chairman, I do have an amendment at the desk.
Are you ready to proceed with your amendment in the nature of a substitute?
I am.
The clerk shall report the amendment.
Amendment number 001, amendment in the nature of a substitute to the committee print offered by Ms. Edwards of Maryland.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentlelady for 5 minutes to explain her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today I'm offering an amendment in the nature of a substitute. This substitute is actually based on the text of the bipartisan bill from last Congress. I firmly believe that this bill is a better starting point for our subcommittee because it stands a better chance of actually being enacted into law. I do want to thank Mrs. Biggert for working with me on the manager's amendment to address some concerns in the underlying bill. I hope this subcommittee continues to work together and in the future will work together from the outset to conceive the best legislative product that can receive support on both sides of the aisle. Given the bipartisan cooperation that's taken place on the Senate side, Senators Boxer and Hutchison in reporting hazards reduction legislation out of the Senate Commerce Committee, it seems that this is one place where this subcommittee might also strike a bipartisan agreement. The bill from last Congress was the product of extensive bipartisan negotiations between members of this committee. We sought to make the bill something of which all of the members of this committee could be proud. So we solicited suggestions and feedback from the minority and made changes based on that feedback. As I stated earlier, this included months and weeks of negotiation. It included making significant adjustments to the authorization levels we had originally proposed. As a result, then Ranking Member Smith joined as an original co-sponsor of the bill, and it was passed by this committee unanimously. In contrast, the committee print that we're considering today was shared with us just days before the originally scheduled markup, and there was no attempt to incorporate our feedback. Although, obviously, with the postponement, we were able to incorporate feedback, which I appreciate Ms. Biggert's support in the committee print. And we did appreciate that unexpected postponement that allowed an opportunity to share our concerns. I'm pleased that we're going to address some of the low-hanging fruit through the manager's amendment later today, something that would not have taken place had the markup proceeded as originally scheduled. Unfortunately, though, this collaboration has not spilled over to our most significant concerns with the bill, namely the low authorization levels and decision to flat fund these agencies over the life of the bill. Last Congress, we made changes to our authorization numbers to ensure it had bipartisan support. Unfortunately, the majority has not shown a similar willingness this time around. Last Congress, we also worked with the other committees with jurisdiction over these programs to ensure that their priorities were reflected. In order for a bill to get to the floor and pass, it needs the support of these other committees. We shared our draft bill with our colleagues on these other committees and ended up making changes, including changes to some of the authorization numbers to get their support. As a result of these efforts, our bill passed the House on the suspension calendar. Unfortunately, in this case, I'm concerned that majority has not worked closely enough with the other committees of jurisdiction to ensure a clear and smooth process through the House. I would point out that the agencies which drew the short straws in this effort are agencies which are primarily or wholly outside of this committee's jurisdiction. It makes me question the commitment of the majority to actually move a bill through the House and similarly through the Senate that we can get to the President's desk for his signature. We seem to be thumbing our noses, in fact, at these other committees. In addition, our bill from last Congress is a bill that's currently moving through the Senate. The bill already has been reported out of the Senate Commerce Committee, and as we understand it from our colleagues in the Senate, it's likely to be considered and passed by the Senate in the near future. If we're committed to getting these programs reauthorized, the truth is that we need the support of the Senate. We know our previous bill has the Senate support, but I'm not confident that we'll get it with this committee print. The Senate bill also has the support of more than 15 stakeholder organizations representing engineers, scientists, building code officials, architects, and emergency management and response leaders. Certainly the top priority of the stakeholders is to get these programs reauthorized, but I'm also fairly certain that they would uniformly prefer the Senate bill over this committee print. The language in this substitute is identical to the language contained in the bill that passed the House last Congress, with two slight modifications. Since the FY 2012 INWRP numbers for NIST and NOAA in the committee print are closer to the numbers we originally proposed last Congress, before we negotiated them down with then-Ranking Member Smith in an effort to garner his support, we've chosen to include the majority's authorization numbers for NIST and NOAA in this amendment and adjust those numbers for inflation for fiscal years 2013 and 2014. Mr. Chairman, let's get these important programs reauthorized. Let's move the bill that we know can garner bipartisan support in the House and that concurrently has bipartisan support and momentum in the Senate. I urge adoption of this substitute amendment.
I thank the Ranking Member Edwards for her amendment, and I will rise in opposition. I am opposed to this amendment for a number of reasons, not the least of which being that it would negate the entire committee print before us. This amendment increases the funding authorization levels well above the committee print and the President's requested levels for the first fiscal year and continues to increase spending every year of the authorization. It also authorizes the program for 5 years rather than 3. In the difficult fiscal crisis our country is facing, the current committee print represents a responsible reauthorization of 2 programs, which are important to our national safety and security. A number of organizations have supported the committee print, demonstrating support for reauthorization, and Congresswoman Biggert has presented a vehicle that will provide a real opportunity for reauthorization of the programs. The amendment in the nature of a substitute also modifies and expands the activities of the agencies. We must be cognizant of our budget environment, and therefore the committee print does not add significantly to agency responsibilities, but rather provides guidance on continuing ongoing programs in need of reauthorization. Additionally, the amendment in the nature of a substitute expands the committee print into statutes that are not currently addressed in the bill. Finally, I understand that the manager's amendment that Representative Biggert intends to offer today was worked out in a bipartisan manner, and I believe that amendment represents a good faith effort to meet in the middle on a number of issues. While we were not able to include everything in that amendment, there are a number of changes included in that amendment that strengthen the committee print, and while there are areas of policy differences, they were not so substantial as to merit consideration of an entirely different vehicle at today's markup in the form of this amendment in the nature of a substitute. For these reasons, I must oppose the gentlelady's amendment in the nature of a substitute. Is there any further discussion on the amendment? Gentlelady from Illinois, Mr. Biggert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm sorry that we haven't reached an agreement here. I always have tried to be the most bipartisan and have worked, for example, in the Financial Services Committee this year. We worked with everybody and found that a bill passed out of Financial Services, the National Flood Bill, 54-0, which everybody turned around and said, what happened? It was so unusual for that committee. This committee, to me, has always been had a very bipartisan nature, and that's one of the reasons that I really like serving on it. So I am concerned about all the rhetoric that I've just heard. But this is a different Congress. This is a different sponsor. This is a different makeup of the committee, and we have reached out to the other committees that may have jurisdiction, and there was one that was particularly said that they didn't want anything to do with it, and if it went over there, it was going to be a problem. So we have tried to cut this as closely as we can to be able to get this to the floor and to get it over to the Senate and have the work in it. And it's also a different Senate than what was set up there. So but I do have the three concerns, and that is the 5-year authorization, and I would think that the 3-year is better in this economic times, and the flat funding, as the chairman said, was at the president's request, instead of the ascending increases in out-year spending that totals $618 million more than the committee print, and adds $113 million more over comparative 3 years. And we just can't afford it right now. We can't spend the money that we don't have, and if we keep it lower, we have much more of an opportunity of being able to reauthorize these. And then the amendment closely parallels, or the committee print closely parallels current mission and responsibility of hazards research versus the expanding scope of research beyond current statute. And you have to remember that this is a committee print. There is no bill yet. And that's why we have done this, is to have the input. And I know that my staff has spent a lot of time with your staff and other members over there, and I think that's the way that this should work. And so but I just don't think that we can go back to the former bill, and with that, I would oppose the amendment.
I thank the gentlelady. Is there any further discussion on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman,
Chairman of the full committee, Mr. Hall.
I'd like to oppose the amendment. I'm not happy to, but I listened very carefully to the young lady, and she always is eloquent and makes good points. But when she talks about low-hanging fruit, that's usually the most expensive because it's the easiest gathered. And I looked at this first and had my mind made up that I couldn't be for it because it added over $100 million. And I look a little closer, it's not just $100 million, it's $618 million when compared with the committee print. This isn't the time to be spending that kind of money or extending the time. For those reasons, I oppose and urge a no vote.
Thank the chairman. Is there any further discussion on the amendment? Hearing no further discussion on the amendment, are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Hearing none, the vote occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by the gentlelady from Maryland. All those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. No. The noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, I'd
Yes.
ask for a recorded vote.
Clerk will call a roll.
Chairman Quayle. Chairman Quayle votes no. Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith votes no. Mrs. Biggert. Mrs. Biggert votes no. Mr. Nagelbauer. Mr. Nagelbauer votes no. Mr. McCall. Mr. McCall votes no. Mr. Fleischman. Mr. Fleischman votes no. Mr. Ridgel. Mr. Ridgel votes no. Mr. Holtgren. Mr. Holtgren votes no. Mr. Cravat. Mr. Cravat votes no. Mr. Hall. Mr. Hall votes no. Ms. Edwards. Ms. Edwards votes aye. Mr. Sarbanes. Ms. Wilson. Mr. Lipinski. Mr. Lipinski votes aye. Ms. Giffords. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan votes aye. Ms. Johnson.
Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, 3 members vote aye and 10 members vote no.
The amendment is not agreed to. Are there any other amendments to the committee print? For what purpose does the gentlelady seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The next amendment is offered by the gentlelady from Illinois, Mrs. Biggert. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 045, amendment to the committee print offered by Mrs. Biggert of Illinois.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading without objection, so ordered. Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes to explain her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The amendment before us, I think, was worked out in a bipartisan manner among committee staff, and I believe represents a good faith effort to meet in the middle on a number of issues. While we were not able to include everything in this amendment, there are a number of changes included that strengthen the committee print, and I appreciate the ranking member's willingness to work with me on these provisions. Briefly, the manager's amendment includes the following provisions. Number one is to add social science to the trends in science that the advisory committee for the earthquake and wind programs should examine. Number two articulates that one of the activities of NEHRP program is supporting public education and outreach to help prepare for and respond to earthquakes. Provides for the termination of the earthquake and winter storm advisory committees 5 years after enactment. And number four strengthens the coordination of research, development, strategic planning, and budgeting across the federal disaster programs. The manager amendment, I think, adds language to ensure coordination, not duplication of disaster activities within the federal government. And with that, I would urge support for the amendment.
I thank the gentlelady for her amendment and for her good faith efforts working in a bipartisan manner to strengthen the bill. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment. Are there any other comments or people want to discuss the amendment? Ms. Edwards.
Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to say I am pleased to support Mrs. Biggert in this manager's amendment, and I do appreciate that with the committee print having had our ability to have have input on the committee print. Although obviously there are other things that we'd like to do to strengthen it, it's really important for us to have had a role in trying to strengthen what's before us. And so I appreciate her willingness to work with us. The amendment makes some important improvements to the committee print. For example, we've been concerned on this side of the aisle that activities within NEHRP and NWRP are not sufficiently coordinated with relevant activities at non-program agencies. Specifically, in hearings earlier this year, we heard from officials at the Department of Homeland Security's Science and Technology Directorate and the Department of Transportation's Research and Innovation Technology Administration about work they were performing to improve the disaster resiliency of our nation's communities to earthquakes. However, when asked how those efforts were being coordinated with NEHRP, they indicated there was limited interaction. We need to make sure that we're leveraging resources across the entire federal government and that one agency is not duplicating efforts already underway at another agency. Therefore, I'm pleased that we're able to work together to bolster interagency coordination in this manager's amendment. The manager's amendment also addresses our concerns about terminating the advisory committees at the end of the authorization period. If I've learned anything during my time in Congress, it's that even well-intentioned efforts to get programs reauthorized on time fall short. I'm pleased that the manager's amendment ensures that the agencies will continue to benefit from the oversight and counsel of the advisory committees, even if we're unable to get a reauthorization bill over the finish line before the authorization expires. These improvements, as well as a number of other important changes, make the bill we're considering today better. And I again want to thank Mrs. Biggert for working with this side to address some of our concerns in the manager's amendment, and I urge its adoption.
I thank the gentlelady. Is there further discussion on the amendment? If no, the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Are there any other amendments to the committee print?
Mr. Chairman,
For what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk, amendment number 011.
Next amendment is offered by the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Hall. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 011, amendment to the committee print offered by Mr. Hall of Texas.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading without objection, so ordered. Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to explain the amendment.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding the markup as usual, and appreciate the interest and efforts of both Mrs. Biggert and Congressman Nagelbauer and the minority, the support that they've given. The committee print before us today proposes to change the leadership of the earthquake investigations from the United States Geological Survey to the National Institute for Standards and Technology. However, after gathering additional feedback from various stakeholders, we talk about how it would better go in the Senate and how it would better progress as it moves across the floor. It appears that we need a better understanding of the current system of investigation before transferring this responsibility to NIST. So my amendment would essentially maintain the status quo, keeping the current responsibility and funding for and especially funding for post-earthquake investigations at the U.S. Geological Survey, while also asking USGS to use the coordination expertise of the earthquake program's lead agency, NIST, when conducting such investigations. I urge its adoption and yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman, and I will recognize myself in support of this amendment. I thank the chairman of the full committee for his amendment, which removes the transfer of responsibility and the funding for the coordination of post-earthquake investigations from the United States Geological Survey to NIST. Rather than transferring this role to NIST, this amendment directs USGS to utilize the coordination expertise of NIST in organizing investigations on the implications of earthquakes by each of the agencies in the NEHRP program. Furthermore, the amendment adjusts the authorization amounts of the United States Geological Survey and NIST and the National Institute of Standards and Technology, bringing both program authorizations in line with the administration's agency's fiscal year 2012 budget requests. In the difficult fiscal crisis our country is facing, the amendment represents a good faith effort at a responsible reauthorization of the program. I look forward to continuing to work with Chairman Hall and other members of the committee, and I urge all of my colleagues to support the amendment. Is there further discussion on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman.
The gentlelady from Maryland, Ms. Edwards.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Unfortunately, although I appreciate that Chairman Hall wants to make sure that NIST is not forced to take on responsibility for coordinating post-earthquake investigation, if it's not provided with the funding, it needs to fulfill that responsibility. But I'm concerned that the motivation for the amendment is not really the best policy. Instead, it's compliance with a confusing set of legislative protocols regarding where we're pushing and pulling funding. We just spoke to the importance of the advisory committees here, and yet the NEHRP Advisory Committee in its 2008 report recommended the transfer of post-earthquake investigations from USGS to NIST, consistent with NIST's role as the program's lead agency. In hearing after hearing, we heard expert testimony praise the job NIST has done as a lead agency. Furthermore, the experts are in agreement that it's appropriate for NIST to also coordinate post-earthquake investigations under the program. And when we talked to NEHRP agencies about making this change in the bipartisan bill passed by the House last Congress, they were supportive of the change. And the bipartisan bill making its way through the Senate right now, which is based on the bipartisan House bill from last Congress, also authorizes this transfer. But as I understand it, both USGS and FEMA have understandably expressed concern that their authorizations were cut by 13% and 18% below current spending levels in the committee print, so that the NIST authorization level could be raised to accommodate the transfer of the responsibility. And so it's not that the policy is wrong, it's that the funding levels are wrong and the other agencies have suffered cuts that have to be absorbed. The truth is that all of the NEHRP agencies, including USGS and FEMA, are already underfunded at existing spending levels. The NEHRP Advisory Committee and the stakeholder community at large have indicated that current spending levels are inadequate and the pace of implementation of the program is being compromised to the point that opportunities for low-cost mitigation measures are being lost. The NEHRP agencies can't afford any further spending cuts, that's clear. And in this time of budget uncertainty, federal agencies are fighting to protect every single cent. But here's the rub. Either we think it's good policy for NIST to coordinate post-earthquake investigations or we don't. Either we take the recommendations of the advisory committee or we don't. And if we think it's good policy, we should authorize that transfer and provide NIST with the resources it needs to carry out the responsibility. And those resources should not come at the expense of other NEHRP agencies who are already struggling to meet their responsibilities under the program. As an authorizing committee, our primary objective should be to make good and reasonable policy. Unfortunately, what this amendment proposes doesn't have anything to do with what's good or reasonable in terms of the policy implication. Instead, its only concern is compliance with what I believe are misguided funding protocols. We simply can't legislate in this kind of way. It doesn't serve the American people, and we'll suffer disasters that we won't be able to respond to because we're approaching this in the wrong way. The members of this committee, our agencies, and our constituents deserve better than that, and for this reason, I cannot support the amendment. With that, I yield.
Thank the gentlelady. Is there further discussion on the amendment? If no, the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Are there any other amendments to the committee print?
So I have an amendment to the desk.
Next amendment is offered by the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Lipinski. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 036, amendment to the committee print offered by Mr. Lipinski of Illinois.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to begin by thanking my fellow Illinois and my neighbor, Mrs. Biggert, for authorizing this committee print, as well as thanking her, Chairman Hall, and Chairman Quayle for working with me to address some of my concerns in the manager's amendment. There's one additional issue I'd like to address in this amendment that I'm offering, an amendment to ensure that social science research is adequately included in a national windstorm impact reduction program. This year's tornado season was one of the worst in this country's history, killing 546 people and causing $6.5 billion in damage throughout the Midwest and the South. I believe that research into resilient structures, as envisioned by this legislation's authors, will certainly help reduce the impact of these storms. But in addition, a better understanding of how both organizations and individuals respond to disasters will lead to more resilient institutions and response and planning strategies that save lives. Many people erroneously believe that calling 911 after a major disaster will bring them help within an hour, that highway overpasses are a good place to shelter from a tornado, or that opening windows can help equalize pressure to prevent damage to a house. None of these are true, and I think social science research is important if we want to understand why these myths are so pervasive and how we can better inform Americans about safe actions to take, or if we want to improve institutional structures, disaster response plans, or risk assessments. That is how the institutions that we have set up, local law enforcement, others, respond to these disasters. We want to make improvements to that. Social science research can help. My amendment would include social science research in NWERP in a similar manner to how it is now included in the Earthquake Hazards Reduction Program in this legislation. When tornadoes or hurricanes strike, the behavior of people and organizations matter. And I believe that the Impact Reduction Program should include what we know about behavior. Adopting my amendment would make sure that we are using all information at our disposal to improve disaster resiliency strategies for our communities and to help make Americans safer. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Lipinski, and I want to thank you for your amendment. And I appreciate your desire to include language regarding the use of social science research to inform windstorm risk mitigation and preparedness strategies in NWERP. The bipartisan manager's amendment considered today includes provisions adding social science to the list of different scientific disciplines assessed by the advisory committees for both the wind and earthquake programs. However, I am concerned about highlighting the role of research in social sciences over other types of science research. What are you considering to be included in social science? And I yield to you to answer these questions. I just have some questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. The information about, such as what people know about response, how people respond to disasters, how then they expect the institutions that we have set up, mostly law enforcement, others that they go and deal with, how they interact with them when there is an emergency, how they respond to warnings that come from, say, the National Weather Service, understand what they do so that we have a much better understanding of the behavior that people engage in, because I think people can be much safer than they are. Those myths that I had mentioned, I mean, certainly those are things that I remember hearing growing up. Opening windows to equalize the pressure would make a difference. those things don't work. There are things that people can do, I believe, that work. And I think by bringing social science research in learning about people's behaviors, learning about institutions' behaviors, the communications between different jurisdictions in an emergency, these are all types of things that can help in to mitigate problems that occur in windstorms. We just included this in NEHRP with the manager's amendment, and I think that would also be helpful in this section of the bill.
Reclaiming my time, I am concerned just about how the specificity of having this type of research when other types of research aren't specified in this bill. I just don't know if this is going to send some unintended consequences of focusing on and highlighting social science research. Do you think that it is necessary to include this type of specificity when they're already doing this type of research going forward? Or is the specificity actually needed when that'll be a part of the broader research that is going to go on with NWERP and NEHRP? And I yield to the gentleman.
Thank you. Well, the only place when it comes to NWERP that the social science research is included is in the advisory committee's assessment of the program. And I think if we're going to say in the advisory committee's assessment of the program that we should use social science research, I think it also makes sense to include that in the broader part of this section of the of this legislation. And it was included in the bill that passed out of this committee on last year, and I think it would be good to continue to include that because it's something that is sometimes forgotten and not considered. That's why we included it last year.
I guess it goes back to kind of the question that I have is the specificity for social sciences necessary in the broader bill when other types of research are not specifically labeled out, in that when you do list things, a lot of interpretation will go, well, they did list social sciences, but they didn't list others, so social sciences should take precedent. So, and I yield to you just to try to clarify that.
Well, a 2006 National Research Council's report on NEHRP noted that the efforts are needed to compare catastrophic events and to examine societal responses in relation to variables such as warning time, magnitude, scope, and duration of impact. And the report found that more social science research is needed to understand long-term disaster recovery. So the NRC said that more social science research is necessary when it comes to emergencies. And so I think that is why we included that last year in this bill, because NRC says it's been missing and it tends to be overlooked.
Okay. Well, thank you. And I think I just do have some concerns about, I agree with you that people need to understand this, but by specifying this in this manner, I don't know if it's the best way to go about it when we already do have the advisory committee where it is specified out. But I do appreciate what you're trying to accomplish. And is there any further discussion on the amendment? Gentlelady from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I didn't think I would speak, but I want to thank the gentleman from Illinois. And I have to tell you, when I joined this committee and sat through a number of hearings that we held on the importance of social science research, it was something actually completely new to me. But I think, as my colleague rightfully points out, that if we want to create communities that are resilient to disasters, we need to understand the behavior of the people in those communities. This includes understanding what an individual does when a tornado or hurricane warning is issued, as well as what motivates people to develop an emergency plan or to retrofit their home to withstand high winds associated with tornadoes or hurricanes before they happen. We can also perform all the engineering and natural science research we like, but in the grand scheme of things, if we don't have a clear understanding of the human element in disaster mitigation, preparedness, and response, then the efforts may be for naught. Building disaster resilient communities will take an interdisciplinary approach that includes social science research in order to make sure that we have strong communities. I would note that in the underlying statute, there actually are a couple of areas where specific kinds of research are specified. So, for example, there's research, development, and technology transfer to improve loss estimation and risk assessment. There's research, development, and technology transfer to improve simulation and computational modeling and windstorm impacts. This would add another area of research in an area where there are certain areas of specificity with respect to research, and I think would be a strong component, because it wouldn't do us any good to have, all the other research that we do, the engineering changes that we make, and then not to understand how it is that people are going to respond in a natural disaster. And with that, I yield.
Thank the gentlelady. Is there further discussion on the amendment? If no, the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor, say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Are there any other amendments to the committee print?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The next amendment is offered by the gentleman from New Mexico, Mr. Lujan. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 003, amendment to the committee print offered by Mr. Lujan of New Mexico.
Oh, sorry. I just gave consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The bipartisan version of this bill from last Congress included a fire research title to ensure that NIST continues to carry out important research on fires in the wildland-urban interface, which is where homes and communities are tucked in and intermixed with wildlands such as forests and grasslands. Unfortunately, that title is missing from the committee print that we are considering today. As more and more communities are expanding into areas in and around forested and other wildlands, it's more critical than ever that we conduct this important research. For this reason, my amendment restores this important fire research provision. Since the bipartisan bill passed the House last Congress, the severity of the U.S. fire problem has grown, and the amount of damage caused by fires at the wildland-urban interface has risen. In fact, from January through September of this year, we saw more than 7.7 million acres burn across the U.S. This is the fifth worst year on record for wildfires, with the Southwest being hit particularly hard. According to the National Interagency Fire Center, there have been more than 7,000 wildfires in New Mexico, Arizona, and Texas. Both my state of New Mexico and neighboring Arizona have seen more than 1 million acres burned. In fact, both states have suffered the largest wildfires in their histories. The wildfire, which burned in the White Mountains in eastern Arizona and western New Mexico, was declared the largest fire in Arizona history, causing an estimated $109 million in damage, burning over 500,000 acres, destroying 72 buildings, and injuring 16 people. Also in June, the Las Conchas fire in my district burned more than 104,000 acres in just 6 days. More than 100 buildings were destroyed and 15 people were injured by the fire, which blackened the slopes of the Jemez Mountains and threatened both the community of Los Alamos, and the Los Alamos National Laboratory. The truth is, what we do not currently have a complete understanding of how fires behave in the wildland-urban interface. This lack of understanding is limiting our ability to develop effective fire safety systems and technologies. In the Fire Prevention and Control Act of 1974, we charged NIST with supporting fire research to help preserve and control fires. My amendment updates the statute to ensure that NIST continues to conduct research on fires occurring specifically in the wildland-urban interface. NIST fire research will help us minimize the spread of wildland fires into communities through tools that predict and reduce fire risk, post-fire investigations, improve fire codes and standards, and safe and effective use of emerging fire technologies. Addressing these research needs is essential if we're going to reduce losses from fire and increase the resiliency of buildings and infrastructure. Mr. Chairman, I urge adoption of this common sense amendment and yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman. I want to thank him for his amendment and appreciate his desire to amend the National Institute of Standards and Technology Act to include the ability for NIST to conduct research into fires at wildland-urban interface. In general, I am supportive of NIST conducting this work. However, it is important to consider how this amendment changes the scope of the Natural Hazards Risk Reduction Act, which amends the Earthquake Hazards Reduction Act of 1977 and the National Windstorm Impact Reduction Act of 2004. I am concerned about Mr. Lujan's amending the National Institute of Standards and Technology Act, potentially opening the bill to provisions that are not in NEHRP or NWRP programs. Thus, I would ask that Mr. Lujan consider withdrawing this amendment I would welcome the chance to work together on this subject as the committee print moves forward and moves throughout the legislative process, because it is a very important issue, and I look forward to working with the gentleman from New Mexico going forward, if he would be willing to withdraw the amendment.
If the chairman would yield?
Yep.
Mr. Chairman, I understand and appreciate the majority's concerns about how the provisions may open us up to non-related amendments on the House floor, and I certainly respect the desire to preserve this committee's product, and I'm very open to working on some agreeable language if there is a hard commitment to do so before full committee markup.
Absolutely.
With that being said, Mr. Chairman, I withdraw the amendment.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Lujan. Okay. Are there any other amendments to the committee print? Oh, the amendment is withdrawn, for the record. Are there any other amendments to the committee print? Hearing none, the question is on the committee print. The Natural Hazards Risk Reduction Act of 2011 as amended. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. All those opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman?
Gentlelady from Maryland.
Well, finish up first. I ask for a recorded vote.
Recorded vote. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Quayle.
Aye.
Mr. Quayle votes aye. Mr. Smith. Aye. Mr. Smith votes aye. Mrs. Biggert. Aye. Mrs. Biggert votes aye. Mr. Nagelbauer. Aye. Mr. Nagelbauer votes aye. Mr. McCall. Aye. Mr. McCall votes aye. Mr. Fleischman. Aye. Mr. Fleischman votes aye. Mr. Ridgel. Aye. Mr. Ridgel votes aye. Mr. Holtgren. Mr. Korvac. Aye. Mr. Korvac votes aye. Mr. Hall. Aye. Mr. Hall votes aye. Ms. Edwards. No. Ms. Edwards votes no. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes votes no. Ms. Wilson. Mr. Lipinski. Ms. Giffords. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan votes no. Ms. Johnson. Ms. Johnson votes no.
The clerk will report. Mr. Holgren.
Mr. Holgren is not recorded.
Gentleman from Illinois.
Mr. Holgren votes aye.
Any other members who want to be recognized? Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, 10 members voting aye and 4 members voting no.
The committee print is agreed to. The gentlelady from Illinois is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to include in the hearing record letters of support for the reauthorization of the National Earthquake Hazards Reduction Program and the National Windstorm Impact Reduction Program from the American Geophysical Union, the American Society of Civil Engineers, the National Earthquake Hazards Risk Reduction Coalition, and the National Council of Structural Engineers Association.
Without objection, so ordered. I now recognize myself to offer a motion. I move that subcommittee forward the committee print the Natural Hazards Risk Reduction Act of 2011 as amended to the full committee. Furthermore, I move that staff be instructed to prepare the subcommittee report and make necessary technical and conforming changes. The question is on the motion to forward the committee print as amendment. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the committee print is favorably reported. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. I move the members may have 2 subsequent calendar days in which to submit supplemental minority or additional views on the measure. Without objection, so ordered. This concludes our subcommittee markup. The chairman declares the subcommittee adjourned. No, this is my third one.
I just emailed the office to bring me anything to read that can take to the House clear.
He's going to run over there. No, I think you're going to be running to the House for
I told him right here. Let me just see what. Okay.
Where's that?